You may feel it as a leader before you actually experience it. It is coming like a tidal wave. It's going to affect your organization, your staff, your team, and how you do business. And it is called the looming talent crisis, as Dave Hutchinson calls it and has labeled it. He is my guest today, and we're going to talk about this looming talent crisis in the not-for-profit sector and what you can do about it. I am so pumped about this topic. Obviously, Dave, first of all, welcome to the show, Dave.
Thank you, Jenny. Good to be here.
Good to be here. We have had so many like coffee date conversations about this topic. So I'm really excited to bring it to the listenership and get their feedback and sort of, get the two different sides. My constituent group, my client group is the folks that are the executive directors and who are seeing how hard it is to fill spots.
Mm-hmm.
Tell the audience about yourself, what you do for a living, and yeah, tell us more about you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, great to be here, Jenny, and thank you for the invitation to be part of the podcast. So I've been in the executive search and recruiting business now for coming up on 27 years, and I would say 26 of those years I've been in some fashion serving the charitable sector. Started off small years ago, and then it grew into what is now our exclusive focus, which is the charitable space in Canada, and that's dealing with CEOs and executive directors and heads of philanthropy and lots of different positions that support what goes on in the charitable space in Canada today.
Yeah, it's a big role. Okay, why looming? Tell me more about this looming crisis.
Yeah, and so the way I've described this is that you could just look at this from a demographic perspective and say, okay, it's because the boomers are closing in on 65 at the bottom end, and demographically, Gen X is a smaller generation, sandwiched in between an even bigger generation behind with the millennials, right? And higher number of millennials than there were boomers, and they are now the largest living generation. But when you look at I would say the charitable sector, particularly in Canada, there are other sectors that are facing talent issues for sure, no question about it. They have more people and more money to throw at it. The issue that the charitable space faces is, more limited resources, particularly when it comes to money, and also limited resources on the talent side because Gen X really wasn't attracted in the numbers that we needed, say 20 or 25 years ago, from a succession planning perspective. A lot of the roles were filled by boomers, understandably so. We didn't do succession planning well enough to attract Gen X, and now we really need to be leaning in on the top end of the millennial group, kind of mid 30s to early 40s, and impress on them the need for leadership in the charitable space in Canada today. Some of them may be ready, and that's great, but some of them probably haven't been given the opportunity to either lead or be developed as leaders. And so that's a concern that I have. And so one is the limited number of Gen X people in our space. That's part of the crisis. And the next crisis, if we miss the millennials the way we miss Gen X, that's an even bigger crisis. But in that we have a lot of them to choose from and try to attract, then at least we have the opportunity to also build mentorship and leadership development into that cohort. So it's not a completely gray sky. It's not entirely blue sky either. So it's trying to find that balance right now.
Yeah, that double tsunami piece, that's something you've just added to the mix here. I've certainly felt it, right? Yeah. Like you put out a job description, and it's like crickets, or you get, just, the LinkedIn sort of copy and paste, nothing's relatable. It's so time consuming, Okay, I have so many questions. Let me start with this.
Yeah.
What does good succession planning look like?
Thoughtful and values-based, I guess, is really where I would start with that.
Thoughtful and values-based. So tell me more.
Yeah. So obviously we're working in a sector where organizations truly do impact the lives of stakeholders, those who are the recipients of whatever the mission or cause might be. And so there's obviously some values-based elements to a lot of the work that happens in the charitable sector, and has for decades, has for thousands of years, probably, as far as
Yeah.
people being concerned about others. Um, Philanthropy is our, how we care for other people.
Yeah.
So the I think that it's really comes down to, how do we do it thoughtfully? How do we do it in a way that is going to, uh, and maybe thoughtfully is another word for strategically, or
Yeah.
combination of the
Touche.
two, right?
Yeah.
Um, so in our space, we really just, part of it is time. We really need to give
Yeah.
time to the process.
Yeah.
We need to sort of step back and go, okay, we need this person for X number of weeks, months, years in the future. What are we doing to prepare not only our current team for what the transition is going to look like,
Yeah.
but to give us time to find the individuals that we're looking for. So time is a big piece of it. Investment is going to be a big piece of that, right? So not just investment in the process, but the process is going to cost something, right?
Yeah.
Whether you use a search firm like my work or whether you try to do it on your own, there's a cost. It's going to, the
Mhm.
executive director's cost, the board of directors costs, who are volunteers. So it's cost on cost when you're asking a volunteer to do it. Um, but recognizing that there's going to be a cost in money, there's going to be a cost in time, and making sure that those two are aligned as
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
then there's going to be a cost to the organization, just culturally, right? You bring a new leader in, whether it's a CEO or an ED, or even a head of philanthropy,
Yeah.
or frankly board succession planning for the board turnover that's going to happen over the course of time, whether it's through bylaws and terms, or whether it's just through
Mhm.
somebody's finally come to the end and they have to move
Yeah.
on from the board. So those are the big ones, I think.
Yeah.
But the cultural cost is something that people don't always pay attention to. So time, money, cultural cost. I think those are the big ones that we need to be thoughtful about. And then in that, what are the values of the organization that are going to either make that a very positive experience, or potentially derail a situation?
Yeah. So it's funny. I just had a client that asked me to do a risk assessment, which is not really a
Okay.
typical thing that I do, to be
Hmm.
perfectly transparent. But it strikes me that succession is kind of one of the largest risks that you could identify that has a massive impact and cost to the organization,
Yeah.
which would make the case for, to your point, doing it thoughtfully and timely.
Mhm.
And this is more, just for our audience, to me, this is more than just professional development, like having a professional plan for everybody, which I
Yeah.
hope most people have some kind of a plan
Yeah.
for all their employees. Because if you don't have a plan for them, you can bet your bottom dollar they're shopping their own plan somewhere else at
Absolutely.
another shop, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
But really kind of thinking about the current leadership, what the succession flow is, like not
Hmm.
even so much like mid to high, even. You're kind of making me think about emerging to mid,
Yeah.
places for people to go, Dave. And like,
Hmm.
I think some of this is sometimes tacit, like understood, but not articulated with leadership.
Yeah.
Are you also suggesting with succession that we start saying these things out loud to the team? This is where I see you. These are some of the skills I think are great for you. These might be places that you could go, Dave?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right, Jenny. We often leave this to the, what about CEO succession? Let's talk about that. Yeah, it has to be on the risk matrix of every board of directors. It needs to be at the board level talked about with the CEO. I would say at least once a year. Like, what's you know, uh, what do we call it? We don't call it being hit by a bus anymore. It's winning the lottery.
Yeah.
So let's say they get hit by the lottery bus, and they're not coming back to work on Monday. What does
Yeah.
that mean for the organization?
Yeah.
Um, well, first of all, they maybe got their first biggest donor ever, hopefully. But
Yeah.
no, I'm all kidding aside. From the perspective that risk is always part of succession, it needs to be part of every board, as I say, every board of directors agenda for at least an annual revisit of that. And then asking of the CEO, well, what are your succession plans for your people? Who are the the VPs or the other directors that are reporting into the CEO or the ED? Are there succession plans for them? But I really do believe, like, from an organizational perspective, even a culture perspective at the organization, what are the opportunities for people from the frontline staff right up to the executive staff for future advancement or succession within the organization?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's always better to grow your talent internally. There's going to be times where it makes strategic sense, or you don't have a choice and you have to go to the marketplace to find talent. But how can we build it internally?
Yeah.
How can we turn our managers into directors, our directors into VPs, and that type of thing? So, succession is probably the most important element on any risk matrix, for sure.
Yeah. You're talking my language. You just said a whole bunch of words I love, right? Mentorship. You didn't say coaching, but I'm going to throw into the mix this idea that when you identify a career path or an opportunity for someone, supporting them through mentorship and maybe coaching opportunities to help them get there is also an organizational responsibility. And we know from the data, at least my data, when you invest in people in coaching, they tend to stay, not leave.
That's right.
Full stop.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. But is there a place for them to go? And that internally is the organization growing? Is it creating opportunities for people to stay, or is it creating barriers that are forcing people to leave? And I think those are really important questions for leadership and boards to be asking. What is happening within our organization? And the other thing we didn't talk about was the cost of a bad hire, right? If we don't do succession planning well, and we don't invest the time and the energy and what it needs to find the right leader, and we lose, or the process goes sideways a year from now, well, that's 10 times the cost, probably.
Oh my gosh. And I just think about all the lost trust, the lost, who are these yahoos? Did they not notice X and Y?
Right.
Okay. So let's flip to the other side. I'd love to talk about the process of recruitment, for lack of a better word. I've been involved in a couple of them. My experience, and let's tie into the concept of succession too, because you talked about culture. In the old days, Dave, did they have gifts of six figures? Did they, there's kind of like this checklist we could have, and you could map the characters across from it. That is not the landscape we're in now, correct?
No. Well, I wouldn't say it's not, but it shouldn't be. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so tell me more. How do you guys approach it? And I especially around the culture thing, because it's an intangible, but in my experience, it's been the defining factor in the end for successful versus not successful placements.
Yeah, I mean, going back to values and thoughtfulness, right? Values in particular. Does the organization actually live up to what it says it does? It's one thing to market a job or market the actual organization and say, this is what we do. But then when you sort of peel back a few layers of the onion, it's like, well, those values really don't align with what the employee experience is, or the donor experience, but we're talking about employees. So is the employee experience, once they're in the organization, they've accepted the job offer, they've been there for 6 months or 9 months or a year, does that align with what they thought they were coming into? And if it does, that's great. Then that serves culture really well. If it doesn't align, well, that creates a really bad, potentially very bad situation if the employee decides to leave, or if other things are happening in the organization that are counter to what the values are espoused to be. But maybe more than a few people leave, so there's that element too. I think it starts at the board level.
Oh, really? Interesting.
I mean,
good for you.
The board creates culture to a degree. Certainly, the CEO and the ED create culture too. But they're working hand in hand with the board.
So what kind of questions so I see your role as sort of the intermediary, right? Between the candidates and the person that has the need. Let's just call them the CEO. I don't know quite who hires you, but whatever. So you're got to glean from these conversations with the organization. They may not use the right words, Dave, I'm going to guess. Like they may say one thing, but like, how do you put culture on paper? What kind of questions do you ask?
Yeah. So we do a fairly extensive upfront conversation with whether if we're being hired by the board to find a CEO, if we're being hired by the CEO or some of the C-suite team to find employees for them. It really is for us at least, outlining a process with the client that said, these are the things that we need to understand about who you are as an organization. Now, a lot of it we have to take at face value, right? We're
Totally.
asking these people to tell us about their organization and what's going on. Um, it probably wouldn't be the first time that a candidate has said to me 6 months after the fact that we're having lunch, I didn't really know about that piece, and I can honestly say I don't think I knew about it either. So there's an
Yeah.
element to which
Yeah.
people tell you as much as they kind of want you to know
Yeah.
at some point. Um,
Yeah.
really, again, really sort of values-based, thoughtful folks are going to tell you some of the stuff that maybe
Yeah.
doesn't fully align with who they are, who they want to be,
Yeah.
but that they're working on it. And
Yeah.
that's at least honest, as opposed to saying, everything's peachy and
Sure.
this is going to be the perfect place for somebody to build
Yeah.
their career. I think we know that that's not true in a
Yeah.
lot of situations. So it is being able to work with and ask the organization, well, what is important to you about
Mm-hmm.
benefits? What's important to you about um, you know opportunities for people within the organization?
Mm-hmm.
Is there growth potential? Is the organization wanting to be more than what it is today, and growing and serving the needs either more in the same area, or are they growing into other areas as well? So I think there's lots of different directions that an organization might consider when they're
Okay.
looking to hire. But our role is to, yeah, ask some of the real practical questions like, what's the job going to be and who are they going to report to, and
Sure.
what does that look like on a regular basis? What's the day in the life of, or a month in the life of, or, it's pretty
Yeah.
hard to predict what a day in the life is these days, but
Yeah.
what's the
Yeah.
next month going to look like for the individual once they start? Um, so and our role is to just try and find the fit between what we understand the culture to be and what we understand the culture that the candidate is looking for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Obviously, yes, there's questions asked, but then it moves into uh, our interviews with the candidates and what their expectations are.
Yeah.
It moves into obviously interviews with the client eventually in the process. What's that chemistry going to look like?
Yeah.
We sit in all of those meetings
Yeah.
as well, and that's part of it is just to observe and see what
Yeah.
is the chemistry,
What the dynamic is like, right?
what's the dynamic, yeah.
Yeah.
And then it comes down to at the end, there's never going to be a perfect organization or a perfect employee, but are they going to be able to grow together and over the next 5, 7,
Yeah.
10 years be able to achieve what they hoped for
Yeah.
the cause and the mission of the organization.
Any words of advice for leaders who are looking to dip their toe in, those people that come from those people? I didn't mean it that way. From corporate,
Yeah, sure.
because I really think there's a way that corporate can fill gaps for us. I
Yeah,
really think that's part of the solution.
yeah.
But any words of advice when you're looking at those resumes that don't have the stereotypical fund development, not-for-profit language?
Hmm.
What kind of advice do you give to leaders at that point?
Um, Either be a great philanthropist and don't come into the sector. Um, Stay out in the for-profit space, make a lot of money, and be a really
Okay.
good donor.
Okay.
That's one element. It's not obviously uh, the holistic answer to your question, but I think let me just start from the sector side. Okay, I think the charitable sector in Canada today has done itself somewhat of a disservice by ignoring applications from people
100%.
coming out of for-profit.
100%.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that the reality is that there is lots of transferable expertise. Uh, Admittedly, there are nuances. There are going to be nuances in the charitable space that people from for-profit aren't going to have, and vice versa, because we're
Yeah.
starting to hear about people leaving the charitable sector and going into the sustainability roles at major corporations and that type of thing. So it works both ways. But
Mm-hmm.
to your point, I think it is one of the talent solutions that we absolutely need to embrace. And I jokingly say, people used to ask me a lot, the question surrounding what you've just said about people coming out of for-profit. They used to say, other than Paul Lalofs, who used to be the head of, at Princess Margaret, who do you know that's been successful in making a transition to the charitable space? So this is going back a few years. I appreciate
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
Paul's now left Princess Margaret. But anyways, he did a great job, and people recognize the fact that his um, service to that charity was successful. And so people wanted to find out, well, who's the next one? And but it was always sort of asked in the sense of, we can't think of anybody else.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's lots of people from from the for-profit space
Mm-hmm.
who could come in and be as successful, perhaps even more successful, for many organizations in the charitable space today. I think the sector has been scared, because, well, gosh, what if they bring, efficiencies to our organization?
100%. I
You know,
love that you're saying this, Dave.
well, I might get,
Yeah.
I might get knocked off the wall for it. But anyways, it's, I think it's a reality, though. And that if we're honest with ourselves as a sector, and,
Yeah.
we're both we're both in support of the charitable sector
Yeah.
being all that it can be for the Canadian population today. If we don't have a healthy charitable sector, a lot of really good things will not get done.
Yeah.
So we absolutely need a healthy charitable sector. We need healthy talent
Mm-hmm.
realities that are for that. I think there are many people from for-profit who could bring their finance background, their marketing background, their sales background, and transition well into charitable organizations across the country. And I think we need to keep that door open for sure.
Oh, I love this conversation. I think when they come in, one thing they didn't realize was the complexity of the landscape. I think in not-for-profit, we work in a much more complex landscape.
Yep.
Things are a little bit more clear, and the lack of resources by definition makes it a lot more complex, because you have to find really creative ways of getting to the same end goal without any of the tools and supports.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet the tools and support, well, certainly the tools, we have the same tools, or at least access to the same tools that the for-profit space has now, more so than we've ever had.
Ever.
And I think really it's about who do we hire, and maybe some of the bigger realities are the compensation, and I'm sure we were going to get to that at some point.
Yeah, sure.
Compensation between for-profit and the charitable space. There can be significant gaps, obviously, and our charitable sector is reliant on the goodness of philanthropists, and in some cases government, and in some cases corporations. But however you carve it out, it's donated money, right? And we need to respect that. We need to honor the fact that money needs to be spent well and not foolishly. But at the same time, we also need to hire the best talent that we can afford, and be able to provide that talent with the best opportunities for them to excel in the roles that they go into in the charitable space, should they so choose, so that we don't lose them back to the for-profit space, which is sometimes what happens as well, because of affordability issues from a compensation perspective.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that return on investment, right? Doing an investment to expect a return, whether it's working with a search firm because you find a better candidate, or in my world, you invest in coaching, which has a positive return on investment in both the retention as well as the leadership execution, which in theory helps you retention all the way through.
That's right.
Job satisfaction is becoming more important. Every day we're hearing more and more about that. So we've talked about succession planning. We've talked about recruitment, how to find those magic culture breadcrumbs, if you will. Let's talk about talent within, because I am quite excited about this one, obviously, because at Chavender, we have a next level talent development program. We've really expanded our offerings to go through the full continuum, because what we realized was nobody was helping the brand new, the zero, the newbie, with supports and networking to develop their own peer group and whatever. How do you develop talent from within? What are the steps for that?
Yeah, I think the obvious steps are, what is the relationship between the internal mentor, whether that's the CEO or
Okay.
the ED or or anyone else on the leadership team, because it has to be from the leadership team. If they don't embrace it, then it's not going to happen in
Good
the lower
point.
levels. Um, so, what is the relationship between mentee and mentor as an internal relationship? And sometimes that does require an outside coach, I think, to come in and support both, right?
Yep.
Um, the CEO can be the mentor, but that doesn't make them the coach.
That's right. Yeah.
And so having a person like yourself or anyone else who's involved in coaching with Chavender, but just in the sense of providing that external coach support can be very useful as well. Um, and then it really is the once you've sort of determined what's that relationship look like internally, then it comes back to what are the investments that we're willing to make in this
Yeah.
individual? Is
And
there sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, and to be clear, investments can also be time, right? Like it doesn't
Yeah.
even have to be money. Like we have
Mm,
so many priorities, Dave,
yeah.
but making this, like I can think of when you say a CEO being a mentor, I didn't roll my eyes, but I almost did, right?
Mm,
Because there's so much going on.
yeah.
But I just want to acknowledge time is an investment,
Yeah.
and showing up to the plate and actually doing it as a mentor or a mentee is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. And even I mean to that point, I guess the maybe the mentor is better suited to be external as well in some respects. And that
True.
could be a relationship that the individual has with somebody external to the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah.
We get multiple mentors and multiple coaches too. So I think
Agreed.
we need to sort of expand that
Yeah.
thought too. But there, if beside time, and I 100% agree with you, 100. Time is precious, and it's not always completely available when we want it to be. But there's also investment in professional development, so there's a cost that goes with that.
Yes.
Do we want to grow our internal team over time to be, the old adage? Well, what if
Yeah.
we train them and they leave? And then the answer is, what if we don't and they stay? So
Yeah.
there's an
Yeah.
element to which we do need to invest in people's professional lives as it
Yeah.
relates to the organization and what we expect them to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big piece of it. And some of that's driven by the individual, and some of that's driven by the
Yeah.
organization, depending
Yeah.
on the life cycle of where they are. So,
Yeah. And I'm going to jump in and say that what I'm also seeing is it's no longer the same cookie cutter for everybody. We used to be
yeah,
able to say, well, everybody goes to AFP conference.
right, right,
Done.
yeah,
And I'm seeing a lot more curated professional development plans where, this person needs this person needs this person's identified this as a skill.
hmm
And then to your point of taking all those different skill sets and looking at the matrix of
hmm
succession planning and
yeah,
kind of mapping where they might go. And I find I've been talking to a couple of universities that are doing a good job of that, where they're really proactively identifying the next role for people,
yeah,
especially if they're small, because the small shops just get, what's the word?
cherry pick.
Pilfered.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. They get
that's right.
right out into other shops to get different
Right.
experiences. And I love the intentionality of that approach.
Mhm.
I think it behooves everybody, and nobody wants to do the same job for
Right.
5 years.
No, yeah, exactly. Well, some people do, but not
No, I don't think anybody
probably
wants
not.
to do the same job. Really, really. I mean, I realize I'm an extrovert and
Right.
a learner. Um, can we talk just for a minute about? I just had this moment. One of the things I see is that high performing professional fundraisers
Yeah.
get pigeonholed as high performing professional fundraisers,
hmm
and nobody wants to hire them as CEOs or a succession plan them because they're too valuable as fundraisers. Have you
Right.
seen that?
Certainly heard of it. Haven't always seen it.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. There's an element. We see that in the corporate space too, though, right? If somebody's a
Sales.
really good salesperson, do you really want them to be your general manager, or do you want to
Yeah.
just keep them out in the field selling? Now, part of that is the personality of the individual and their preparedness for leadership
Yeah.
as well,
True.
right? So, if they have an inclination towards leadership, um, that doesn't mean you're going to lose their capacity as a great fundraiser. And in fact, you know this, and I know this, that every executive director and CEO, they're as much a fundraiser on the team as anyone else is. And so, if you make a really great fundraiser a leader, or give them a leadership role. That is, sorry, they're always leaders typically.
Mm-hmm.
But then you don't necessarily lose out. But it has to be the right fit for that individual.
Yeah.
For them, from a professional experience perspective, do they even want it, or do they want to stay being a lead fundraiser?
Yeah.
If they do,
Yeah.
then let them continue to do what they're doing. But
Yeah.
but if they are interested and ready for leadership, then don't deny it. But mentor it, coach it,
Yeah.
invest in it so that they're prepared for taking over
Yeah.
those leadership
Yeah.
roles. It'll take time.
It will take time. Something I think that's challenging or something I've seen as an experience is some of us are, let's call us major gifts officers. Let's just use that as an example. That's one archetype, right?
Yep.
Sort of the touchy feelies, sorry for the language, all over everything. Everything is important. Just amazing at building relationships. Not a lot. I don't mean to insult anybody when I'm talking through, but I'm talking tendencies, right?
Yeah.
Get it done. Don't really write plans. Just know intuitively how to get from A to B, and have done it very successfully, to be clear.
Sure. Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have people managers and process people and structure and project files.
Mhm.
And I'll often see people with these postings that say, have to have 6 gift level experience, but manage a team of 12.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that is like a nightmare to me, Dave. Like
Mm-hmm.
the skills you need for one are complete opposite of the skills you need for the other, right?
Yeah, and yet that's sort of the nature of our market, right? Is that people need to be managed, but money needs to be raised, and you can't always necessarily have individuals doing different things.
That's right.
So part of that is our resourcing, for sure, but at the same time, the nature of our talent pool maybe doesn't always allow for having that variety.
And tough conversations about expectations too, because I think there's a pushback to say, well, what's most important to you?
Mm-hmm.
If push came to shove, what would you be willing to drop?
Yeah.
Or let's talk about succession planning. Can you restructure your org chart? It's not the first time an org chart's been restructured for particular personalities or people, right?
Yeah, right.
I don't mean this in like a pretzel yourself for an employee, but there is always more solutions from a hiring, from a talent management, from all of these things. I think we need to get creative. That's one of my big words here from our conversation today.
Well, I think in one area, and this is, I'll just throw it out there, from the perspective of having international administrative support, and I mean that from the perspective of hiring somebody in another country who can do all of the admin support that you need them to do at a fraction of the cost, and yet still support an executive in their day-to-day needs as a leader, right? So we see that certainly in the recruitment business, and we actually engage with it. I think that's definitely an opportunity for people to hire offshore talent and bring it in as support for Canadian charities and the leaders here.
Yeah. So I'm messing up the expression, but penny wise, pound foolish. That's it.
Yeah.
Penny wise, pound foolish, because you've got this amazing executive director with skills out the wazoo, ability to manage talent. And he's reconciling Excel spreadsheets and trying to, it's so ridiculous, or managing their own calendars because the organization doesn't want to pay for one more full-time admin. I get it.
Yeah. But if you look at some of these overseas solutions, they're very affordable and very credible.
They're very good.
Yeah, very good. So
virtual assistants, that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have given it reference. I was trying to come up with the word as you said it. So that's great. So a virtual assistant, essentially. And they can be anywhere in the world. It really doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So
we started with this concept of the talent crisis, this sort of double tsunami. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I mean, we always enjoy our conversations, Dave, but succession planning, coaching, empowering people, talent within, maybe the last word goes to you.
Mm,
Any final words of wisdom for our leaders,
mm,
advice around the hiring process, finding good talent?
mm.
I'd love to hear those. Any final words you have?
Yeah, I think the word that comes to mind the most is flexibility. I think that's the nature of the talent pool that we're involved with today. Um, and understandably, especially coming out of COVID, and as far out of COVID as we are, it still resonates very strongly within the marketplace, particularly around hiring and what does hybrid and remote work look like. That is still an ongoing conversation, and some organizations have have adapted to it and
Yeah.
are continuing with it. Others are struggling with it, and I appreciate both. Right,
Me
you
too.
either adapt or you
Me too.
struggle, but either way, you're going to have to come up with an answer that works for your organization. So flexibility, and that's not just hybrid and remote, but is your workforce, is it all permanent full-time
Yeah.
employees? Are there contractors? Are there
Yeah.
people on an interim basis, like an interim executive that you can bring in? It doesn't have to be the CEO. It could be another role in the organization, but it
Yeah.
doesn't need it 9 months or 12 months of the year.
Yeah.
So project-based talent, I think those are things that organizations need to look at. Yeah, and consultants, I mean, consultants like us have been around for a while, so that's not anything particularly new, but consultants can sometimes serve
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
purpose to the organization as well. Um, as it relates to talent, again, within that framework of flexibility, we talked about it already, but the for-profit
Mm-hmm.
uh, people who are very interested in making a change out of for-profit. There's lots of reasons why people want to leave for-profit. Money is not necessarily their driving
Mm-hmm.
reason, and or sorry, money is not necessarily the driving reason why they would come to charity. So
Yeah.
be mindful of the fact that it's not all about trying to match what they were making in corporate. They could be purposely moving for a good reason. Um, I think that's part of it, and then from just a general hiring perspective these days, give yourself as much time as you can. Like if
Yeah.
I know you can't necessarily deal with the somebody comes in on a Friday and resigns scenario. You got to kind of react to that. But if you can avoid having to react, and you've
Yeah.
got some time to give it some thought and thoughtful planning, then give yourself as much runway as you can, I guess, as far as that's concerned,
Yeah.
especially for
Like,
organizations that are growing, and know that they're going to need more talent over the next several months, whether you engage with a firm or whether you're doing it on your own. Yeah,
yeah.
plan that out as much as you can. So,
Yeah. I love the word flexibility. That's a great theme.
mm,
If folks want to connect with you, Dave, if they want to talk more about this, how can they find
yeah,
you?
causeleadership.com is our website. dhutchinson@causeleadership.com is my email. Feel free to email me. Happy to chat with anybody, or organize a time to chat with anybody.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
It's a great title. Great company name, Cause Leadership. I like that very much.
thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, we hope it resonates, because
Yeah.
it's
Wonderful.
it's about causes, but it's also about sparking or catalyzing leadership, and so we're trying to be both. How do
Yeah.
we
Oh.
spark leadership within our space?
Yeah, I love that. I love the thoughtfulness too from today's conversation.
Mm.
So, dear listeners, what resonated with you on this conversation? Was there elements that you're going to start incorporating into your org charts? Has anybody come off this podcast being like, I'm so excited about professional development plans for all my team?
Mm.
I would love to hear about this. So if you've had a revelation from this podcast, I'd love for you to send me an email, jenny@chavender.com. That's Chavender, like lavender, but with a CH at the beginning. And, we do these podcasts in the hope of sparking ideas and creativity in the people that we're reaching out to through podcasts. Love to hear your feedback and your experience of the podcast. So, Dave, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here, Jenny. Always fun to
Awesome.
connect with you.
Always fun. We always have good conversations. Listen, to all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and go be great.